welcome to History 300, the origins of the First World War. Lecture 17, the Serbian response, July the 24th to July the 25th, 1914. After hearing that the Austrian ambassador had delivered the text of his country's ultimatum, the Serbian Prime Minister returned hurriedly to Belgrade on the night of July the 23rd and went into session with his cabinet the following morning. They met non-stop throughout July the 24th and July the 25th. The ultimatum demanded a response within 48 hours, and though it did not specify what would happen if Serbia failed to comply fully with its terms, clearly Austria had drawn a line in the sand. Some kind of military encounter between the two states seemed virtually inevitable. The ultimatum's terms were severe. It demanded that the Serbs suppress all publications within their country which incited hatred and contempt of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, that they remove all propaganda against Austria-Hungary from Serbian schoolbooks and public documents, that they dissolve the Serbian ultra-nationalist organisation Narodna Odbrana, which the Austrians believed, mistakenly as it turned out, had been involved in the assassination plot, that the smuggling of arms and explosives across the border into Bosnia should be immediately suppressed, that any military and civilian officials that the Austrians chose to name should be immediately fired from their offices of state, that Major Tankasic and Milan Ciganovic, whom the Austrians suspected, correctly this time, of having assisted the assassins, be arrested and handed over to the Austrians, and that Austrian policemen be allowed into Serbia to conduct an independent investigation of the Archduke's murder. That last point in particular was crucial, not only because, if it had been allowed, it would undoubtedly have revealed the extent to which Serbian government officials were well aware of the plot's existence, but also because it would have been such an affront to the rights of national sovereignty that it would have effectively ended Serbian independence. When he received a copy of it in London, Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, called the ultimatum the most formidable document that has ever been addressed from one state to another. Even the Kaiser, on holiday in his yacht in Norway, described it as a pretty strong note. The Austrians were well aware of how difficult it would be for the Serbs to accept such a set of demands. The ultimatum had been deliberately drawn up to be unacceptable. The Austrians were looking for an excuse to an attack, not a settlement. Pasic knew that he had to calculate his government's response to the Austrians very carefully. If he utterly rejected all its terms, he risked making Serbia look like a power that was refusing to compromise to prevent war, and this might alienate foreign sympathy. On the other hand, if he accepted all of its terms, then he risked a swift backlash from members of his own military authorities. The civilian government in Belgrade was not, after all, really in control of the country's army, and men like Dimitrijevic already had a well-established reputation for taking violent action against civilian leaders whom they felt were a threat to national security and honour. Pasic, in other words, was likely to be overthrown and possibly killed by his own countrymen if he appeared to be too conciliatory towards the Austrians. The vital factor was Russia. Whatever the Serbs did, they had to have Russian support for their actions. It was unfortunate for Pasic that the Russian ambassador in Belgrade, Nicholas Hartwig, the man who had orchestrated the Balkan League in 1912 and who had been a strong friend of the Serbs and a close confidant of the Prime Minister, had dropped dead a couple of weeks before of a heart attack. The Russians had not yet had time to replace him. It was not clear to Pasic what St. Petersburg's attitude towards the ultimatum would be then. As it happened, in St. Petersburg on the morning of July the 24th, Sergei Satsanov, the Foreign Secretary, was sitting down with the other members of the Council of Ministers to decide what the Russian response to Austria's action should be. The Council's initial decision seemed cautious. It sent a telegram to Belgrade advising the Serbs to comply with as many Austrian demands as possible and to wait for international mediation to resolve the crisis in their favour. But as Sean McMeekin notes in his book, Satsanov may already have decided to take a much tougher line than this actually suggested. Later in the day, he spoke with the Serbian ambassador to Russia, then told him that while it would be wise to accept some of the more innocuous proposals in the ultimatum, the Serbs should not give way on the really crucial demands, especially those concerning Austrian investigation of the murder. The Serbs could expect Russian assistance, though Satsanov was a little vague about what exactly that meant. The earlier telegram sent by the Council of Ministers may have been intended more for the eyes of the British and the French than the Serbs. Satsunov had to appear to his allies to be counselling caution, even if he really was not. The council also decided on July the 24th to advise the Tsar to begin some secret preparatory mobilization procedures. These he agreed to order the following day. The pre-mobilization steps were theoretically aimed only at Austria, but as McMeekin suggests, Satsunov may have known perfectly well that the idea of a so-called partial mobilization only against Austria was really nonsense from a military point of view. Either Russia mobilized along its entire frontier, which meant along its border with Germany too, or it did not effectively mobilize at all. Either way, these steps were to be a closely guarded secret for the time being. Satsunov had to be careful, again, not to suggest to his allies that Russia was being overly belligerent. He knew in particular that the British would take some convincing before they were willing to consider intervening in a dispute over Serbia. It was vital that Germany and Austria appear to be intensifying the crisis, not Russia. Seizing and maintaining the high moral ground was going to be critical for the Russians over the days to come. Indeed, in London, Sir Edward Grey was taking steps to offer international mediation to try to bring the crisis to a peaceful conclusion, just as he had been able to broker an earlier peace deal in the Balkans in 1913. He asked the German ambassador to Britain, Prince Lichnowsky, to suggest to Berlin that the three powers least involved in the dispute, that is, Britain, Germany and Italy, should agree to arbitrate between Austria and Serbia and mediate a solution. Grey did not know anything about Germany's secret blank cheque given to Austria on July the 5th. He assumed that the Germans were as uninvolved in the dispute as his own government was. For the time being, the British Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, was willing to let his Foreign Secretary handle events. Asquith said that he regarded the Austrian ultimatum as bullying and humiliating, but he saw no reason why Britain should particularly get involved. Back in Belgrade, Pasic and his ministers worked feverishly on their response to the ultimatum all day on July the 25th. Finally, at 5 minutes to 6, 5 minutes before the expiration of the deadline, he arrived at the Austrian embassy to hand it over. The Austrian ambassador glanced at it, saw that it did not unconditionally accept all of the Austrian demands, and so, acting on instructions from Vienna, curtly dismissed it as a rejection. His bags were already packed in the embassy hallway. He and his wife immediately left for the station and caught the first train. They had crossed the frontier and were back in Austrian territory by 6:40 p.m. The Serbians were left wondering what would happen now. Okay, in the next lecture, we'll look at events from July the 26th to July the 28th, 1914. See you then.